From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Donald Trump is campaigning on higher tariffs, including a new universal tariff that could take the U.S. back to the days of Smoot-Hawley. But would he do it? Could he do it? And how big of an economic risk does this pose for the U.S. and the world? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Alicia Finley and editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua. He once called himself a tariff man, and Donald Trump is back at it during the 2024 presidential campaign. He's proposed a blanket baseline tariff on everything imported to the U.S., something like 10% to 20%, while also floating higher border taxes on anything coming from China, maybe up to 60%. Let's hear from the man himself. This is Donald Trump at the Economic Club of Chicago last week, speaking with the editor of Bloomberg News.
Critics say your tariffs will end up being like a national sales tax.
No,
because
the countries
if you have America at the moment has $3 trillion worth of imports, you're going to add tariffs to every single one of them. That is going to push up the cost for all those people who want to buy foreign goods.
No, what's going to happen?
That is just simple mathematics, President Trump.
It's not. Yeah, it is, but not the way you figured. I was always very good at mathematics.
Yes.
Let me tell you, you're saying $3 trillion.
That's
Those companies,
$3 trillion worth of imports.
And they don't have to pay. And the higher the tariff, the more likely it is to have them come into the country.
The higher the tariff, the more you're going to put on the value of that piece, those goods, the higher people are going to have to pay in shops.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away.
The first thing to point out here is that the tariffs that Trump is talking about this time would dwarf what he did in his first term. The Tax Foundation has a recent analysis saying that the average tariff rate on all U.S. imports in 2017 was about 1.4%. Now it is about 2.4%. And the ideas Trump is talking about now could push that all the way to about 18%. That would be the highest since the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, which the economic consensus says worsened the Great Depression. So, Alicia, in comparison, the first-term Trump tariffs were relatively targeted. And maybe a place to start is to remind listeners what Trump did in his first term on tariffs.
So if you recall, his tariff wave really started in 2018, and he began with the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. He claimed that these were intended to protect national security and that foreign imports of steel and aluminum presented a national security risk to our U.S. industry. And the theory was that this was reducing our own industrial base, the imports, cheap imports, and therefore they were in national security. Never mind that the vast majority of the steel and aluminum consumed in the country aren't actually used for any kind of defense. And we can get that actually from Canada and other allies that he was imposing tariffs on. Now, he actually ended up making some one-off agreements with various countries, Canada and Mexico as part of the USMCA, and Europe. That was in part to avoid the retaliatory tariffs that ended up happening, which is when other countries threatened or actually imposed tariffs on U.S. goods in response to these Section 232 tariffs. Now, there were other tariffs that Trump imposed, mainly in 2018 and 2019. These were on the washing machines. So you recall there was a big dust-up over Whirlpool. And it actually ended up resulting in, not surprisingly, higher costs on washing machines, but also reducing U.S. manufacturing and hurting some U.S. companies in that. Solar cells, that was because the U.S. was getting a lot of cheap solar panels from not just China, but also the Southeast Asia, and the U.S. Solar manufacturers, in which there really aren't many, complained about that. And so Trump slapped tariffs on solar cells, which, by the way, the Biden administration has continued. And then there were the Section 301 tariffs on China and a variety of goods that were imposed under this law that allows the president to impose tariffs if the goods are being, quote, dumped. The countries are engaging in any unfair trade practices. And what ended up happening with these tariffs is A lot of them actually weren't imposed because there was an exclusion list because they would have been so onerous on U.S. businesses that use these goods. Apple got an exclusion, for instance, for iPhones. But there were a number of other exclusions that were granted. And they didn't actually achieve what they were intended to do, which was to get actually China to reform in its mercantilist system and to stop stealing U.S. intellectual property. Those issues have continued. And as Harris has often pointed out, in some ways, the trade deficit has actually increased. Not that we should really be concerned about this, but even by Trump's measure of one of the goals, which was to reduce the trade deficit, it wasn't really successful.
Another thing to keep in mind is that the Constitution gives power over trade to Congress. But lawmakers over the years, particularly during a period where the consensus was to expand trade, have delegated that authority to the executive branch in certain cases. Alicia lists two of them. One is Section 301, allowing the executive to deal with unfair trade practices. Another is Section 232, allowing the executive to deal with threats to national security. And the powers delegated there are pretty broad. Section 232 lets the president adjust imports for national security reasons. It does not define national security tightly. It says that includes the general security and welfare of certain industries if they are believed to be critical. And so that was a place where I think the Trump administration in his first term stretched the law a little bit. As Alicia points out, the Department of Defense said that it needs its use of steel and aluminum are only about 3% of America's annual production. Trump considered but did not put tariffs on foreign cars. The Commerce Department drew up this report, which was not issued in the Trump administration, making the argument that foreign automobiles are a threat to national security. So that is something that we might see in a second Trump term, is more use of these powers under 301 and 232 to do targeted tariffs on certain products, certain industries, certain countries. But Monet, this did not achieve what President Trump wanted for reasons that are pretty classic Econ 101. There was retaliation by America's trading partners. They raised their own tariffs on everything from whiskey to apples and exports of those products. U.S. exports fell for those products. There was no big boom in manufacturing jobs. If you look at you can go find the data on manufacturing jobs, and there's no obvious huge uptick there after the tariffs were put in place. And in fact, some of the economic studies say that it costs manufacturing jobs because far more people work in industries that use steel, that use aluminum, than work in the U.S. creating those metals. But Monet, it is notable, too, that whenever Donald Trump and his trade advisors are asked about these studies, they dismiss them kind of out of hand. Robert Lighthizer, the trade advisor, I think last year, suggesting they're corporate funded studies and so forth.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that there's a ton of macroeconomic evidence of the failure of the Trump tariffs and the general failure of tariffs to point to show that consumers end up bearing the costs when these types of restrictions are put on foreign goods coming into the country. But I think it's also useful to look at individual case studies that help to paint that picture for voters who are thinking about it and trying to make up their minds about whether they think tariffs would be a value add to the economy as it exists today. And I think there's no clearer case study than U.S. Steel over the course of the past few years. This is a company that was positioned to be one of the top beneficiaries of Trump's tariffs. Of course, as Alicia mentioned, he put 10 to 20% levy on steel imports. And this is particularly targeted at China, which is the world's largest exporter of steel. And in the United States, there is a large share of steel that is used in our manufacturing industries that is imported. It's about 35% of steel that we use is domestically produced. The other 65% is imported. And so this is an area where it would seem like it was drawn up to be a perfect example of how tariffs would have a positive effect, if only just for that company. And what did we see when those tariffs were imposed? U.S. Steel's market share didn't really increase by a particularly great amount. Their output didn't particularly increase, and their share price has been stagnant since about 2018. There wasn't a major expansion in jobs that coincided with the tariffs either. And they found themselves after about 5 years end up looking for a buyer. And of course, they ended up settling after quite a lot of politicking on Nippon Steel as the best company to come in and potentially rescue them. So the irony, of course, is that a foreign producer ended up being the best position to actually take over that American company after the failure of the tariffs to bring about their intended effect. And of course, the consequences were even more negative for all manner of other industries that aren't being directly benefited by these tariffs because they're relying more on bringing in intermediary inputs for products that they're creating. So the vast majority of productive industries in this country and services have also seen no positive effect from the tariffs, and consumers did see the beginning of price increases from things like beer cans and other things that depend on expensive inputs that were made more expensive by Trump's tariffs. So there isn't a strong economic case that there is a job benefit to the tariffs, and it's very clear to see that consumers are bearing the brunt of that policy.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. What about the idea of a universal tariff? Alicia, the suggestion of that by President Trump has created a running debate among wonks and nerds about whether that is within presidential power as delegated by Congress. And one of the statutes that is often pointed to is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And it gives, granted, the president pretty broad authority in the cases of a national emergency. Here's the language: to deal with any unusual and extraordinary threat that originates substantially from outside of the United States. And in past practice, this has been used mostly, I think, as a sanctions law. So presidents have used it to freeze assets owned by Venezuela, to stop exports to Iran, that kind of thing. But it has never been used to impose tariffs. And granted, President Trump did threaten to use it back in his first term against Mexico. And that is part of what led to a deal, including to expand the Remain in Mexico migrant policy. But Alicia, what do you make of this idea? If President Trump in the second term cited this Emergency Powers Act and said, I'm using this to impose a 10 or 15 or 20% tariff on everything coming into the United States, do you think that he would end up in court, and what the result of that might look like?
I think it certainly would end up being challenged in court, probably under the Supreme Court's major questions doctrine. If you recall, that's the doctrine that the Supreme Court used to strike down the Obama Clean Power Plan and the Biden administration's $400 billion student loan forgiveness. Now, this major questions doctrine requires clear congressional authorization for any economic or politically significant executive action. And I think there's no doubt that an across-the-board tariff would qualify as such. Additionally, I think that this could be challenged under the non-delegation doctrine, which hasn't really been sanctioned by the Supreme Court or the current Supreme Court. It was last really used or referred to during the 1930s. But this is the idea that Congress cannot delegate its authority away to the executive branch without setting clear limits. And in this case, Congress would have delegated its trade authority to the executive branch. There was actually a challenge to the Trump Section 232 tariffs brought under the non-delegation doctrine. It wasn't successful, but I think you would see another one being raised here. I mean, I know Neil Gorsuch has indicated his interest in considering cases and using this doctrine a little more robustly than the Supreme Court has to date. And I think this would be a ripe case to consider it.
My 2 cents is that I think there would be a pretty good case as well that this is not what this emergency law refers to when it is talking about dealing with discrete emergencies. That does not permit the president broad authority to change trading terms that the U.S. has with the entire world, basically on a whim with the signing of a document. And if it did, it's hard to see what the limitations on that would be. One thing that comes to mind is the idea of a carbon tariff that progressives sometimes talk about. if this emergency law is as broad as President Trump seems to think it is, then could Joe Biden just unilaterally create a carbon tariff, declaring that there is a national emergency in the United States caused by emissions from overseas? So he is going to lay out unilaterally a schedule of tariffs for all kinds of goods coming into the United States from different countries based on his own assessment of the cleanliness or dirtiness of their industry and their power plants and so forth. I think conservatives would be up in arms and asking the Supreme Court to take that case if President Biden tried to do that. Monet, another question that has been raised, I think, by this presidential campaign is Donald Trump's view of tariffs, because sometimes he speaks about them as if they are for reciprocity, that if Japan, for example, would lower its tariffs, the United States under President Trump would be happy to follow suit. Or sometimes he says that it's a matter of leverage and negotiation. And I think in cases that's true. That certainly seemed to be the case, or his intent with regard to that Remain in Mexico policy. But he is speaking more broadly about tariffs, I think, in recent days, including in that clip that you heard at the top, about the idea of creating a tariff wall to force companies to come back to the United States and then to protect them there. And I don't think that that would work out. I think the economic evidence is that would not work out the way that he seems to imagine.
I have no doubt that Donald Trump has a long-standing belief in protectionism, essentially. The idea that American companies should be producing in the United States, should be hiring American workers, should limit their imports to the amount that's absolutely necessary, and that everyone across the economy would benefit from that position, that the companies themselves would perform better in the long run, that workers would see higher wage gains and more plentiful jobs, and that there would be limited damage to consumers. None of this takes account of prevailing economic theories, as we have said repeatedly on this episode and much in print. But Donald Trump seems to have articulated that philosophy as early as the 1980s, I believe, and it's been one of the more consistent themes of his political career, which has otherwise been somewhat scattershot. And so I do believe that he sees them as a powerful tool, tariffs, I mean, to negotiate and to bring about desired outcomes with certain countries. And Remain in Mexico is one of the clearest examples of that. The threat of tariffs over Andrés Manuel López Obrador definitely did bring him to the table and accepting more migrants in the country who are awaiting asylum entry into the United States. But Donald Trump definitely does think that tariffs have value in their own right for economic ends. If you look at what Robert Lighthizer says and writes, he very rarely talks about tariffs as a mere negotiating tactic. He talks all about rebuilding America's industrial base, rebuilding the heartland, a lot of these Midwestern cities and towns that saw jobs go overseas after the United States opened to China. And I do think that Trump could be expected to pursue a strategy that combines both, to continue to introduce certain tariffs, particularly extremely steep ones targeted at a particular country when he wants to bring about a particular concession from that country. But I do think that he's going to, from the very beginning, be thinking about how he would be able to impose broad tariffs because he thinks that that's something that's going to strengthen American industry.